There we go. Okay. Anyway, offer, counteroffer. And then I thought I'd also touch on backup addendums because even though the market is kind of shifting and stabilizing, I did get a question the other day about a backup offer and who fills it out and who submits it. I've got a couple of quick Annie videos on this. They're not very long. They're 5 or 6 minutes. And so we'll let her give her read on it, and then we'll have some conversation and look at the forms. But this is also your roundtable. So if you've got another topic that you'd like us to throw in, feel free. We would love to cover it. So, yeah. I had a question the other day from Wayne Lyle up in the Point, as we call it, Point Roberts, and he said he's got he had 5 offers written this week. He said it's just crazy up there, but he wanted to know how things were down here in the south of the border. I said, I just think it's stabilizing. What are you guys seeing out there? It's summer, it's August. We obviously have kind of a seasonal slowdown a little bit, but I see a lot of activity going on in document delivery and paperless. Anybody? How are open houses now that the weather's cooled off a little? Anybody? Nope. You have a bunch of shy people this morning. All right, you're just going to listen to me for an hour. Actually, I'm going to start by having you listen to a minute and a half worth of Jared James. And like I mentioned, I think I mentioned before, mark your calendars for September 20, I think it's 26th or 28th. I can never remember. Anyway, we've got Jared James coming. RE/MAX is hiring and bringing him out to Bellevue that week of September 26th. I'll give you the date. It's absolutely free. You can bring a realtor friend from another company if you would like. It's not a big recruiting deal. There's not going to be 3 hours of rah-rah about RE/MAX. It's going to be pure Jared for 3 hours. So, and you have me personally to thank for that one. They were going to bring another speaker in, and I said, we want Jared. And if you've never seen him in person, he's amazing. He's every bit as good, if not better. So it's going to be a good one. But I'm going to start out with him, and it's a good one. He just recorded this about a week ago, and it says, "Are we witnessing the 2008 housing crisis all over again?" He says, "Not a chance, and here's why." And I know there's been a lot of perspective on this, but I love his minute and a half explanation. So I'm going to share. And
guys, we are not in a housing crisis. You know, I get all the messages, I've seen the stuff that the news is putting out, and everybody's comparing today's marketplace to the real estate crash of 2008. And, you know, when you look at the number one factor that really matters in the economy, it's supply and demand, right? And we've focused a lot on demand. I've shot some recent videos you can go check out on the demand, the place we're in from demand, but we're not focusing on supply enough. You know, when you look at the 4 years that led up to 2008, we had built twice as many homes as were needed in the market. And on top of that, about 30% of those homes were sold to people with adjustable rate mortgages, with ARMs, which meant that they were going to stay at a certain rate for a certain number of years and then go up, which meant that a lot of times they were purchased by people who couldn't really afford those loans. Now, fast forward to today, right? You look at today's market, Realtor.com released a report recently and said that we have a cumulative deficit of about 5.8 million homes in the marketplace. Think about supply, 5.8 million. That means that we would have to overbuild by 1 million homes for the next 6 years just to get to the place of equilibrium, to health. Think about the place we're at right now with inflation and cost of goods and all of that. Do any of you see a situation where we are going to overbuild by 1 million homes per year? No, okay? The more you know, guys. I mean, the bottom line is work with a pro. If you're working with a fear monger or whatever, get rid of them. Work with a pro in this industry. It'll work out.
okay, hold on here. Driving my
Hey, you.
minute and a half of absolute just gold. There is a lot of talk about the physical housing deficit going on out there. And I read another really interesting article yesterday that said currently 1 in 4 houses in the major metro markets is being purchased by large investment companies. They're scooping them up for rental properties. Why? because we all know the price of rent is going absolutely through the roof. Whether we agree or disagree, it is going to continue to put a squeeze on inventory. And the builders are pulling back right now because the market has shifted. And so they're not going to be as willing to go out and continue to build to help fill in that 5.8 million home deficit. So what's my message in all this? My message is that there is going to be continued huge opportunity for good real estate brokers like us in the next several years. I'm very optimistic. I was talking to a broker yesterday who was actually down at Inman Connect in Las Vegas. And she said there's a lot of doom and gloom going on down there. And she was practically bouncing off the wall. She says, I just see this as one huge opportunity to shine for those people that are educated and knowledgeable and know how to negotiate and take good care of their clients. This is when you build your business. So that's my morning soapbox. That's my morning sermon. Any comments on that? Anybody else agree, disagree? No? Nobody? I think one of you is muted. Okay. All right.
Agree.
Greg Paul, you got a bunch of builders. Are they pulling in their horns or are they still building out there?
I just didn't want you all alone this morning, Lori.
You're not all alone.
Trying to
Join me.
get some dialogue going from all of us. But
Good.
yeah, I mean, I just got 2 offers on lots yesterday, and I sold a lot Friday. But yeah, the builder, it's weird. You know, I work the watershed and they're all busy. They're getting out of the ground. They're invested. This isn't the time for my business to sell lots and get real excited about new construction, but there's a lot going on. So I get busy with vacant land, you know, October, November, December through about March, just because they typically want to get into permitting and in the watershed. So it's quiet, but there is a little life. And even like your previous question, open house, good last weekend at a condo. In fact, one of the people that came through the condo purchased the condo, one of my listings. So there's life out there. Open houses do work, rarely, but they do. And yeah, I don't know if you guys would all agree. I've got several listings. My lock boxes got hit hard last week. There was like a surge. I think rates decreased a little bit. And all of a sudden, I don't know, there was some action in the last 10 days that I really haven't experienced in the week or 2 prior. So who knows?
Hey, the activity, you know, the weather cooled down for one thing. You know, anytime the weather gets super, super cold or super, super hot, it's always it has a detrimental effect on our business. Everybody's either in the lake or home in front of the fireplace, but we're back kind of to normal. So good to know. Good to know. Anybody else want to share any updates on what you think's going on in the market out there that we can all benefit from, learn from? All right. No? Okay. Well, then let's jump in to I'm going to find it here.
Can I say something really quick?
You can say whatever you want really quick. Join me.
I just wanted to let everybody know, I had some agents asking yesterday about the AdWorks. We used to have the free AdWorks for a week on new listings coming from Remax, and they are no longer doing that. So if you're wondering why that is not happening, they cut it off. They did not renew the contract with AdWorks. Remax did not. You still have the ability to go in there and do it yourself, though, if you wanted to pay for it. I just wanted everybody to know because people were questioning why it wasn't working, and maybe it was just them.
There are some people that have pretty good success. It's not necessarily a direct correlation, but they're seeing your name or they're seeing your listing all over the place.
Yes,
So,
I had the agents that were using it before they're now paying for it and doing it anyway because they had such good results from it.
Yeah, if not, and it's not expensive. If you don't know what AdWorks, those are those little pop-ups that if you go shoe shopping, if you're a girl, and then every time you go to a different web page, your shoes show up and they follow you around. Well, AdWorks does the same thing, except they do it with real estate. They do it with either you personally as personal marketing, or they'll do it with a listing that you've got. So, and you can do a geographic fence on that. So if you just wanted to show up within 30 miles of Bellingham, for example, that's who they're going to be targeting. And
yeah, and I've had Carissa and Tammy McKenzie just piped in there in the chat. They have really good reports that you can send to your seller on how many people are seeing your listings and what you're advertising. So it really does have a benefit, just so you know.
And so that's a really good point, because 6 months ago, we didn't worry about that because properties didn't stay on the market as a listing active long enough to have to explain to the seller what was going on. They were just like, boom, okay, it's been 5 days. We've waited. We've got 16 offers. Which one are we going to take? Now we have situations where we're doing price adjustments. We are having to report to sellers at least on a weekly basis, hopefully in writing, about how many times your lockbox was triggered, how many views you got on Zillow, how many eyeballs you got on AdWorks, or on Remax.com. So if you don't have something, a weekly report that you're able to just download, put together, and send out to a seller, you need one. And that might be a topic for another day, which brings me to last reminder. I just started the basic contract mastery class series yesterday morning. The class from yesterday was just on residential purchase and sale. We didn't even hardly get through it. It's up on our Facebook private page, and we have another one tomorrow that will be from 8:30 to 10, and it's on financing and financing addendums. That is probably, that and contingent offers are the two most confusing things that we've got. With the 21 days, when do you deliver? How does that work? The whole 9 yards. So we're going to be covering that 8:30 tomorrow morning. You all should have gotten an invite on it. Okay. I am going to do, so Washington Realtors has its own YouTube channel. And if you haven't visited it, you need to go look, because if you go there and then click on videos, every single hotline video under the sun that's ever been recorded is on that page. I take and copy and throw them up on our Facebook page, our private page. But if you want to take a deeper dive, it's just amazing what is available out there. And then also the hotline, the written hotline Q&A, which we're going to touch on a little bit later. So with that, let me do a little screen share here.
Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors Legal Hotline lawyer. And today's video is another in our series on mistaken identity forms version. And today we want to talk about the confusion of listing brokers in particular, but it could be a buyer broker writing a counteroffer. But let's focus on listing brokers because we've been focused on buyer brokers. So let's talk about listing brokers in this video. Listing broker wants to write a counter offer to the buyer's offer. And instead of pulling out a Form 36 to write the counter offer, listing broker accesses a Form 34, a blank addendum, and writes the counter offer, has seller sign all of buyer's offer, initial the addenda, initial the Form 34 that has the counteroffer terms, and sends it all back over to the buyer broker. Now compare that to the scenario where listing broker properly uses the Form 36, the counteroffer addendum, writes out all of the identical terms for seller's counteroffer, has seller initial that, also signs the buyer's purchase and sale agreement, and initials all of buyer's addenda, puts it all together and sends it back over to the buyer broker. Is there a big difference? There is a huge difference. And the huge difference all comes from very few words set forth in the introductory paragraph of those two forms. Form 36, the counteroffer addendum, says in the introductory paragraph that this counteroffer addendum, or this counteroffer, incorporates all of the terms of buyer's offer except as those terms are modified through seller's counteroffer set forth below. So with the boilerplate language in the introductory paragraph of the Form 36, the counteroffer addendum, we know that this is a counteroffer and that buyer's offer is not accepted as written. Instead, it is seller's counteroffering buyer's offer and modifying it as set forth on the counteroffer addendum. So there's no way that there could be an argument made that seller has accepted buyer's offer, because seller has very clearly countered buyer's offer as described in the boilerplate introductory language found only on Form 36. Compare that to the situation where seller signs all the buyer's offer paperwork, signs the Form 21, initials the addenda, and sends all of that back over to buyer broker along with a Form 34 addendum that sets forth those terms. In that scenario, what has listing broker done on seller's behalf? Arguably, listing broker has had seller accept buyer's offer because there's no modifications made on the face of or through a counteroffer form to buyer's offer. Seller simply signs buyer's offer. And then listing broker provides, along with seller's signature on buyer's offer, a separate addendum. Now, what does that addendum say at the top? That addendum at the very top, the boilerplate introductory paragraph, says, this addendum is attached to and made part of that purchase and sale agreement dated between buyer, seller regarding the property at. This addendum is attached to and made part of that agreement. In other words, we already have an agreement and this addendum is going to attach to it, but it's only got seller's initials on it. So it's not binding unless buyer also initials it. But seller and buyer have already agreed to the terms set forth in the purchase and sale agreement and its addenda. So if buyer doesn't agree to the terms set forth on this new Form 34 that's supplied by the seller and the listing broker, then the Form 34 is simply not part of the agreement. It can't modify the terms of the agreement. At a minimum, the buyers have a fight, the parties may have a fight on their hands as to what is the meaning of this Form 34 that comes back to the buyer along with the seller's signature on the buyer's offer. Buyer or listing brokers, you avoid the fight, which of course is your goal when you're held to the standard of care of a lawyer, when you select the form to use. You avoid the fight by selecting the correct form. The correct form in this instance is a Form 36 counteroffer addendum. Never, ever use a Form 34 blank addendum in place of a Form 36 counteroffer addendum. They are not interchangeable forms. That is a case of mistaken identity with respect to those two forms. If you have questions on this topic or any.
Okay. I learned something the first time I watched this video. That was interesting. One tiny little word can change the whole meaning of a Form 34. And versus a Form 36 with the counteroffer addendum. So let me back up a step, because the question I always get is it better to simply strike the terms on the original offer that came through, initial and date them, and send it off to the other person? So for example, if the seller's countering on the price, strike the price of the offer, write in the new price, initial, always date, and send it back to the buyer as a counteroffer. That is completely legitimate. A lot of people do that. The problem becomes if the buyer then counters the seller's counter. And then you end up with a hodgepodge, especially if there's several things they're countering on the front page. You end up with a hodgepodge of strikeouts, initials, and dates. And you literally have to be a forensic scientist to match up initials and dates to the change that was made. And if you miss one of them, any of them, you don't have a valid contract. So while that is certainly acceptable, it may not be best practice. Either one works. I'm not saying one is better than the other. To me, Blake and I had a long talk about this. The downside of using the counteroffer form can be that if that is the only place that you make the modifications to the contract and not on the face of the purchase and sale and the addenda itself, and you send it off to escrow, in more than one case that I'm aware of, escrow has missed the counteroffer changes. And they get all the way to the closing table with a price that's incorrect or terms that's incorrect because they're just reading off. They don't bother to go through all the addenda all the way to the back. So if you're going to use a counteroffer addenda, my suggestion is always put that on top of the package that you send. And then make darn sure that your escrow closer knows that there's been modifications to the terms of the agreement. It's a simple thing. They're supposed to look for everything, but they're human. They get busy and it can be missed. So let's assume for the sake of this that we are going to use the offer counteroffer form, which I'll pull up here. The other question that I had was, what if the listing broker and the seller use an offer counteroffer form and they send it off to the buyer, and the buyer makes another counter and the seller makes another counter? At what point do you get a new offer counteroffer form? At what point do you delete the first one that you used? Do you put a strike through it? What do you do with it? Because if you've got an offer that's going back and forth several times, which again, 6 months ago wasn't common, the current market that we're in, it may become more common. So that was another question that came up. And I think my simple answer to that is and I've always said this about real estate contracts, you need to dumb it down to the level that a third grader could understand it. So if I had to stand in front of a judge and say, Your Honor, here was the intent of the parties, the judge should be able to go, and I'm not saying they're a third grader, but they're not in the contract. They should be able to go through the contract and understand exactly what your intent was, exactly what the intent of the parties was. There's no confusion. There's no need for a clarification, because if you don't have mutual understanding of a contract, in other words, the buyer and the seller are on the same page as to what they're contracting to do for the purchase of a property, you don't have a valid contract. You do not have a valid contract if you don't have a meeting of the minds. So I always say err on the side of spelling it out, making a narrative, making sure, putting it in an email cover sheet so that it's very crystal clear what your intent is. So if we pull up, I'm going to pull up the counteroffer form here, do another little screen share. And again, feel free to jump in if you got questions. Do you have to add Form 36 to page 1 then? So the addition of the forms on page 1, Deb, is best practice. I recommend it. I believe Blake recommends it. I always think it's a good idea because that is kind of the go-to place, but I don't believe that would invalidate a contract if you neglected to do so. So I still say yes, it should be added because then you've got to initial it. But if you forget, I think you still have a valid contract. So let's take a look at this form that I'm talking about here. The counteroffer addendum to a real estate purchase and sale agreement. And some of you may not even know this form exists, but it does. So all terms and conditions about the property, by the buyer. And so here's the difference. So it's kind of a generic form that can go either way. So you put in obviously the date of the contract, the address of the property, fill all that in. But then here, it doesn't delineate buyer or seller like a normal top part of a contract or a form 34. If I flip over to a form 34, you can see here it talks about buyer, it talks about seller, but over here on our counteroffer addendum, it's left blank. And then there's a little drop-down menu where you pick one. Whoever is making the counteroffer is the one who would go first. So in this particular case, let's say the buyer is countering back to the seller. Now let me turn that around. Let me make it really simple. The seller is countering back to the buyer. The buyer makes an offer. I'll stick with Annie's example. Buyer makes an offer to the seller. Seller says, okay, I agree to everything except I want to modify the closing date and I don't like the purchase price. Or maybe I want more earnest money. So the, actually, I think I have these backwards. Hold on here. Buyer, seller. Yeah, because the seller is the one who is going to sign this. So you've got two choices. You can do either or both. Purchase price is modified to, and again, you write out the numbers and then you write it out longhand, or other down here. Earnest money shall be increased to, closing date shall be modified to. But here's where it says everything is accepted except for the following changes. I'm coming back to you here. And like she said, those little words are what gets confusing. So let me show you again. I'm going to do a quick share because I want to show you here down at the bottom. It's the same terms. A counteroffer shall expire at 9 p.m. on, and it defaults to 2 days, just like the counteroffer in the purchase and sale agreement. You've got to deliver a copy of it. And so if it's the seller delivering this back to the buyer, oops, there you go. So here down at the bottom, sorry, I forgot to click a button. Counteroffer expires at 9 p.m. This is at the bottom. 2 days after is what the default is. Unless it's sooner withdrawn, we'll talk about that. Effective acceptance is not effective until you deliver a signed copy. And then in this particular case, the seller would sign. So the seller is saying, I accept all your other terms and conditions except this. Now, if the buyer says, yep, great, that's awesome, willing to pay a little more, willing to move the closing date, add a little money to the earnest money, I like everything we've got, they just sign it off and you are done. Here's where it gets a little bit confusing. What if the buyer says, I don't mind the price, I don't mind the closing date, but I am not going to increase my earnest money. I am going to leave it as it is. What is best practice on this form? Well, if you think about it, here we go, back to the form. Sorry for going back and forth, but if you think about it, this is kind of a one-way counteroffer. So if the seller is saying to the buyer, here's the things I want, and the buyer says, yeah, that's all great, except I don't like the third one. I want to do a counter, what we call a counter to your counter. Would you reuse this form? I would make the argument you would not. Why? Because it would get confusing. If you strike, let's say they had earnest money of $5,000 to be increased to $10,000, and the buyer strikes it and says, nope, I don't want to do that. Well, if the buyer comes down here to sign, you got a conflict because it says the above counteroffer is accepted. Well, they're not really accepting it, they're countering it, right? Are you with me? Am I confusing you all? So
I'm with you, but then do you use the counteroffer again?
Yep, you do. So my suggestion, and again, Blake and I did talk about this, and I think it might be best to strike this or remove it. You can remove it as long, but if you're going to remove it, you need to incorporate the other two changes that the seller wanted. and incorporate it all into a new counteroffer back to the seller. So you can say the new purchase price is, and you agree with the seller, you plug in the same price they wanted. You can say the new closing date is, and you can plug in the closing date that the seller wanted. And then you can say, and the earnest money shall be $5,000, which is what the buyer wanted. So the buyer is now making a counteroffer back to the seller. And then the buyer would be the one to sign the top line. And these would be reversed. And it would go back to the seller. So once they have signed all the pages of the purchase and sale agreement and all the addenda, you don't need to go back and initial that every time you make a counteroffer. You've done it. It's all signed off. It does need to be completely signed off, right? So when the buyer makes the offer, they've signed everything. When the seller goes through, and even if they make a counteroffer, the seller has to sign the purchase and sale agreement. They have to initial all the addenda that goes with it, and then they would complete this counteroffer and submit it back to the buyer. If the buyer decides to counter the counter, the buyer doesn't need to go back and sign the purchase and sale and all the addenda again. They've already signed it, right? So they're creating a new counteroffer back to the seller. Are you following me? As opposed to, let's say you just say, Julie says, you know what, I hate that counteroffer form. I never use that counteroffer form. I'm just going to go make the changes on the contract. Or maybe it's not Julie, maybe it's somebody from ABC. So they strike it on the front page. They strike the earnest money, they strike the closing date, they write in what they want, they get their guys to initial it, and let's complicate it and say there's 4 sellers. So now we have 4 sets of initials on 3 different changes and dates. So we got 9. No, we got 12. Then it goes back to the buyer, and there's a couple of buyers. There's maybe a husband and wife or whatever. Now you got 2 more. But remember, in my example, the buyer is countering back to the seller. So now we're going to strike it again. We're going to make 3 strikes, or we're going to make 1 strike. They're going to write it all in. They're going to initial it again. They're going to send it back to the seller. And you can imagine what the front page of that purchase and sale agreement looks like at this point, right? It looks like a spaghetti Western. I've seen them. I have actually had to sit down and with a highlighter and try and match up dates and initials to changes made on the contract. And remember what I said about if it's got to go in front of a judge and they have to decide, did you have a mutual meeting of the minds on this contract? If I've got a piece of spaghetti on the front page of that, I'm going to say, hell, Your Honor, I think they did. That was the intent of the parties, but maybe I screwed up because I'm a licensed real estate broker, but I didn't handle this correctly. So the point I'm getting at is you not only need to be familiar with this form, but it's kind of like your commission negotiation. It needs to be a bright line. This is how I operate. Now, if you're dealing with a listing broker and that's not with us, or they don't like to use the counteroffer form, that's fine. I mean, I'm not going to die on that hill. I'm really not. If they send back the purchase and sale all marked up. But let me make one caveat. If it gets to the point of being spaghetti on the front page of that purchase and sale agreement, I strongly recommend that you rewrite that front page for informational purposes, clarifying what the final agreement was and have everybody re-sign it. Okay? The reason being, escrow needs to understand what's going on, the lender needs to understand what's going on, and in the event of a dispute, a judge needs to understand what's going on. And it's up to you to make sure that all the parties understand. Tessa Jarvis, I saw your hand up there a little while ago. I wasn't ignoring you. I just wanted to finish my train of thought. You there?
Oh yeah, I'm here. I was just going to pipe in. It almost feels like when we talk about the 35R, when we're doing inspection responses, and we're like, it can almost be as a worksheet, right? You go back and forth and it gets so battled and bloodied. And you're like, just pull out, when you finally get to that agreement, pull out a brand new one and get it clean. And that feels similar to what you're saying with this counteroffer addendum, right? To just, like, you're countering the counter, start fresh, and you get a new one. It's like a worksheet to just keep everything clean and tidy.
Exactly. You've got to be able, it's got to be understandable. And I know that sounds, and heaven forbid the people that write in the changes, at the very least, you should strike it and use the center sign to type in the changes. because no offense, but some realtors' handwriting are right up there with doctors, and it's hard to read. So anyway, I want to show you one other form that kind of goes hand in hand with this. And it's called a withdrawal of offer or counteroffer. And I think more people are familiar with this. So this is something that happens in the event. So let's go back to our original example. Buyer makes an offer, seller comes back with a counteroffer, and they haven't heard back from the buyer yet. The buyer hasn't accepted or countered their counter. In the meantime, the buyer or the seller receives another offer. It's $50,000 more. It's all cash, closes in 3 days. And the seller says, oh my gosh, Luis, I need to accept this one. Get rid of that other offer. I no longer want to counter and take what I told him I would take. Or it can work the other direction where the buyer maybe makes an offer and another house comes on the market and the buyer then says, Luis, this house is more perfect. Get me out of that contract. I don't want to make the offer on that house anymore. Or I countered and I don't want to make that counter anymore. There's this form called withdrawal of offer or counteroffer. And the rule is really, really simple, that your client can withdraw an offer or counteroffer at any time up to the point that it has been accepted in writing and delivered by the other party. Why would you not want to call the other broker and let them know that you are withdrawing your offer or counteroffer? Because all contracts need to be in writing, Washington law. And so you call Susie Q with ABC and say, hey, you know what? My clients, they found another house. They don't want to make an offer on this one anymore. And we're going to be withdrawing the offer. And so I'm going to get you the paperwork within the hour. What would prevent Susie, listing broker, from hurrying up and having her seller sign the offer, send it back to you before you can get the withdrawal, and boom, you are under contract? Now, there's other ways to get out of the contract. I get that. But it just makes it messier. So the best standard of practice on the order on which to deliver this, as a matter of fact, a lot of really good brokers will have their clients sign this at the time they sign their offer. Why would you do that? For just that reason. What if another house comes on the market? What if something changes in their circumstance and it's Saturday night at 10 o'clock and you need to hurry up and do a withdrawal and your clients are in their motor home over at Lake Chelan with no cell service and you can't get them to sign this? You cannot, as a broker, withdraw an offer or counteroffer without your client's signature. That is a requirement. So best practice is to have this signed at the time you get your offer signed, to submit it to the other party as well as document delivery in writing, and then you pick up the phone and give them a courtesy call. So this is really simple. Withdrawal is part of the purchase and sale agreement concerning this property. And they give you the choice, multiple choice. Is this being delivered from the buyer to the seller and listing broker, or from the seller to the buyer and buyer broker? And the attach, so you have to attach the original paperwork. So either the complete offer, let's say it's a buyer withdrawing before the seller accepts, or a seller who has countered and they decide they want to withdraw that counter and accept another offer. So you pick one of these and then you have your client sign it. What do you notice about this? This is a notice, not an agreement. It only takes one party's signature. So if the buyer is withdrawing, you need to have the buyer's signature and that's it. The seller doesn't have to agree to it. The seller doesn't have to sign off on it. This is simply a notice, and then vice versa. Does that help? Does everybody know about offer, counteroffer, and all that other good stuff and how that worked?
I'm curious, can I ask a quick question? How many brokers, as part of their practice, fill out a withdrawal and have that ready to, I mean, I've always thought about it, like, oh, do I need to have one of these ready? How many people do that as part of their business, to sign the offer and then have a withdrawal ready to go just in case?
I will tell you, if you ever get burned with the scenario that I just laid out, you will never not do it again. If you've got a client that's on the road, like I said, in the Rockies or at Chelan or somewhere without cell coverage, and they absolutely want you to withdraw an offer counteroffer, like, it's horrific. If you're a listing broker and another offer does come in, and it's a lot more money, and the seller says, get me out of that contract, but they don't have access to email, you got a problem. So, it's just something that would be good to have. It's good practice. I don't know of that many people, frankly, that do it. I do know of some that do. So anyway, that's anybody else. Does anybody do this as a matter of course, or is anybody going to start doing it now that we've talked about it? Because in this market, we do have a lot more offer counter offer stuff going on. We should be at Tessa. Yeah. You're right, Sai, we should be. It's just something I wanted to make all you aware of. It's one thing that might set you apart. Obviously, something you want to have a conversation with your client about when you're having them fill out the contract. It is not obviously submitted with any of the paperwork. It's just something you have them sign and you keep in your, super secret file folder. But do you think maybe that might be something that might set you apart from other brokers, that you're thinking that far ahead in the event that something like that did happen? And don't forget, time is of the essence. It's kind of a race to the finish line once your client decides to withdraw. If the other party signs off and delivers an agreed upon contract back before you can get this withdrawal in, you're in a whole different ballgame. Now you're trying to kill a mutually agreed upon contract, as opposed to just withdrawing a unilateral. It only takes one to withdraw, but it takes two to stop a contract, right? So this is just the easy way of doing it. Joelle had a buyer broker call me to withdraw, but didn't submit the paperwork. So my clients went ahead and accepted the offer. Rookie mistake. How many times have I heard about other brokers who just pick up the phone and say, yeah, we're going to be withdrawing, or, hey, they've changed their mind. I'm not saying they can't get out of the contract. Maybe they've got a, 35 or whatever. It's just, it's not the professional way to do things. So you always deliver it in writing, and then you make the courtesy call. I always recommend the courtesy call. If you don't get them, please leave a voicemail. Just let them know what happened. You don't need to go into the details. My clients have changed their mind. They're no longer going to be making this offer. Do check your email. I have submitted a withdrawal of offer or counter offer, whatever that is. Make sense? Okay. Let's move on. So next thing I got up is another mistaken identity. This one has to do with a backup addendum. And I've had questions about this. The question I had the other day was, who fills out the backup addendum? Does the listing broker do it as a, kind of a counter, or does the buyer broker do it and submit it? So this one's really short too. It's only 3 minutes. So let's go through and see what Annie has to say about backup.
Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors Legal Hotline lawyer. And today's video is another in our series entitled Mistaken Identity for Forms. Form 38A, the backup addendum, is not the same thing as a Form 39 second buyer's addendum. When this becomes an issue is when seller has sold their home to a home sale contingent buyer, a Form 22B buyer. Seller is still looking for another buyer who will be the bumping buyer. That new buyer comes along, that is the second buyer, and the second buyer can bump the first buyer, the home sale contingent buyer. Listing brokers, you must use the Form 39 second buyer's addendum in this situation. Only the Form 39 second buyer's addendum has the contingency language in it, allowing seller to avoid the obligations of this purchase and sale agreement with the second buyer if the first buyer fails to satisfy or waive the home sale contingency. Form 38A does not provide the contingency language that your seller needs to deliver the bump notice to the buyer and then say farewell to the second buyer if the home sale contingent buyer ends up satisfying or waiving the home sale contingency. So when you are representing a seller who's already sold their home subject to a home sale contingency, Form 22B, listing brokers make sure that when the bumping buyer comes along, you include a Form 39 second buyer addendum in your seller's counteroffer back to that bumping buyer. Your seller should never, ever enter an agreement with a second buyer while their home is already pending to a 22B buyer unless the Form 39 second buyer addendum is part of that purchase and sale agreement between seller and that second buyer. If you have questions on this topic or any other, visit the legal hotline.
Okay, so I'm sure I've got eyes glazing out there because contingent offers get confusing. So what they're saying is you're a listing broker, you get an offer contingent on the buyer selling their home, and you go under contract, so it is pending with a bump clause. And another buyer comes along and makes an offer on the same property, and you want to accept that offer and hold those buyers in place while you give the bump notice to the first buyer, letting them know they've got 3 days, 5 days, whatever your bump clause is, in order to get their home under contract and satisfy the contingency, or waive the contingency altogether and proceed to closing, or notify the seller that we can't get it sold, we can't waive, and we're out. Go ahead and sell it to the other people. Those are the three choices that the buyer has at that point. So how do you hold that second buyer in place while you're dealing with the first buyer's bump clause? That's what the message here is about. But I'm going to expand it a little, and we are going to take a look at that backup addendum so that you can see kind of what it's all about. So let me go to form. Here we go. So here's a backup addendum to a purchase and sale agreement. You can use this for any, it doesn't have to be on a contingent offer. You could be under contract subject to an inspection. You could just be a flat pending. And somebody else comes along and says, hey, Julie, we really love the house. If anything happens, would you please let us know? And you, as a good listing broker, say, hey, I'd love for you to put that in writing. Go ahead and submit your offer, and we will put you in what's called backup position, which means if the first offer fails to close, you automatically move forward into first position on the contract. Now, the advantage to that is that you've secured your position. You don't have to rely on the listing broker being courteous and letting you know if the first sale fails. You don't have to deal with it going on the market and possibly getting in a bidding war with other buyers. You know that your position is secure. The only downside, and it's more psychological than anything, of doing a backup offer, and this is my opinion, is that the first buyer will know there's a backup offer, and so their incentive to close will be increased. In other words, if they get an inspection back and it has some minor items that they maybe, if there was no backup offer, would have asked the seller to correct, if they know there's a backup offer, they may be less willing to negotiate on those because they really don't want to lose their position in first position. As a listing broker, you're sitting in the best of all worlds. You've got two bona fide buyers kind of not arguing, but positioning over purchasing your listing, which is a really good thing to do. Now, the other time it gets tricky is when the backup offer is for substantially more money than the first offer, and the seller is saying, get me out of this first offer, I want to take your backup offer. Well, the problem becomes, as we tell our clients, we don't write offers, we don't write contracts to be easily broken. We write them to be so that the parties can be held to the standards of the contract. So a choice might be, if the buyer does ask for a lot of things on an inspection, Mr. Seller, that you just say, no, I'm not going to do any of them, and hope they go away. But there's no legal way of getting rid of that first buyer unless it's a contingent. So here's our backup addendum. So this is obviously, the top is normal, buyer, seller, address. And what it says is you're putting the second buyer on notice that the property's already been sold. This prevents the seller from having to sell or being in the position of selling a property twice, which you never want to be in that position. That's not just, yeah, that's horrible. So it puts the backup people on notice that we've already got an offer. They're calling it the first sale, and the seller reserves the right to change or amend the terms of the first sale. What does that mean? So let's say that the seller likes the guys in first position and wants to be able to extend the closing, or wants to be able to allow them to change lenders. The seller has the right to do so. Backup agreement subject to the first sale. So the backup agreement means that the seller's not obligated to sell to the second buyer unless the first sale fails to close. Again, we're making it crystal clear the seller is not selling the property twice. It goes through the steps of, if the first sale fails to close, the seller has 2 days to give notice to the buyer after learning the first sale will not close or fails. And there's actually a form that you use for that notice for the seller to let that buyer know. And then if the first sale fails to close, the closing date on the backup offer, this is kind of like a contingency. So listing brokers, don't forget, if you filled in a closing date on your purchase and sale agreement on the front page, you're going to modify it to reflect this. And you're going to say, see Form 38A, because it actually puts the time frame on it. If the first sale fails to close, the closing date of the backup agreement shall be blank day 60 by default from the date of delivery of the first sale failure notice. The closing date in this addendum supersedes the closing date in the agreement. So whatever date you've got on the first page of your Form 21 or your purchase and sale agreement is now a moot point. It's just been negated, excuse me, by this paragraph. Next one, expiration of backup agreement. If the seller has not given the first sale failure notice within 60 days by default after mutual acceptance, then the backup agreement just dies. So the first sale is dragging their feet. They've gone 2.5 months. Backup person says, hey, I'm getting antsy. I want to go back on the hunt for another property. This thing just dies. Or the buyer can terminate it. Buyer can terminate the backup agreement at any time prior to receiving the first sale failure notice. What does that mean? You have a buyer that goes into backup position, and this weekend another property comes on the market that they absolutely love, and they no longer want to be in backup position on this particular property. It's a simple matter of the buyer number 2 withdrawing the backup offer, which they can do at any time up until the point they've been notified that they're in first position. So there's really no risk to this buyer to go into backup position if it's a house they really like while they continue to look for another property. And so they talk about the timelines. All timelines, including deposit of earnest money, shall begin on the date of delivery of the first sale failure notice, which means the buyer number 2 in this agreement doesn't have to deposit earnest money. They don't have to start inspections. They don't have to start financing. They don't have to do anything as long as they're in backup position. Once they get that notice that they've moved into first position, all timelines begin. So my guess is there's probably a little bit more in this addendum than you guys were aware of. It's a great addendum for buyers, and it can be a great addendum for sellers. We're not, again, so much in the market like we used to be with hot properties. We didn't even see a lot of backup addendums then, although we saw a few. But the buyer can go into a backup position and withdraw that backup at any time prior to being notified they're in first position. And the seller gets the benefit of having 2 birds in a hand instead of just 1. So again, this might be something that you might want to talk to your buyer about. If they do find a house they love and it just went under contract, especially if it's during the first however many days for the inspection, that this may be an option that they may want to they may want to think about. So any questions on that one?
I have one.
Sure.
Okay, so we're actually using this backup addendum form today on a listing we have in Everson that we just went under contract on yesterday. So the sellers accepted a financing contingency in an offer over a cash offer that was willing to escalate $200,000 because of a love letter.
Wow.
Yeah. So we are putting, the other agent wants to be backup. And so because of the escalation clause in his offer, when we do the backup offer, can we still escalate from the first offer because it's a competing offer? How does that work?
Here's my suggestion. I would have a conversation with buyer number two's broker, and I would get rid of that escalation addendum, because here's the problem. An escalation addendum needs another offer to escalate off of. If that first offer or contract fails, you don't have that contract anymore, right? So it's gone. If the first contract fails to close, they don't get their financing and they go away, you now have nothing to escalate off of. So you're better to negotiate now with buyer number two to say that, look, in the interest of clarity, let's just negotiate a price, lock in that price, and that would be the price we would agree to sell you the property for in the event you move into first position. It's just much, much cleaner, because I've been in that situation where the backup offer actually has an escalation addendum or an escalation clause. And so when the first offer fails and all the other offers, of course, have disappeared into the sunset, you have nothing to escalate that off of. And so you revert back to your purchase price.
Okay, so then you're leaving that money on the table if we don't negotiate this now and get this done. So like Debbie Benjamin said, do we add that form 38A to their purchase and sale agreement, and then we don't have to redline, or like you said, or do we just start a whole new, have him write it up without the escalation as a whole new contract?
You can use that. I would just strike the escalation. I would delete it out of the contract, and I would modify. You can either use your offer counteroffer, or you can strike on the face of the 21, the purchase and sale agreement. You can modify the purchase price there. So you can do it either way, Tammy. I think it might be easier to just work with what you've got. And at this point, frankly, your seller can counter back at a price. You can have a conversation with the second buyer's broker. You kind of agree on a price and say, okay, great. I'm just going to have my seller counter back at this price. If your buyer's initial off on it, I'm also going to be sending you a backup addendum, which will put you into backup position. And then, so everything is pre-negotiated until they go, and everything's pre-negotiated, period, done. You don't have to go back and do anything at the time that if and when they move into first position. It's all done.
Okay,
Did I answer you?
Yeah, and then just to clarify, when we're, as brokers, when we're putting those counter offers or backup offers onto an offer we received, that then we don't need to mark up the offer because it's all on that counter offers now page 1. Is that right? Or do you add the form to page 1 and then still mark up the contract to reflect the changes in the counter?
At the very least, add it to page 1 and include it and be sure and put it on top. You can you can do both. There's actually a hotline question that talks about that. Annie is a proponent of doing both, marking up the contract and doing the offer counter offer, but the offer counter offer will suffice as long as the contract itself is fully signed by the buyer and the seller. You have a clean offer counter offer form, fully signed by the buyer and the seller. That's all you need. That is a legal binding contract. And then you would add this backup addendum to the purchase and sale agreement. So this would come from you as the listing broker. You would fill this out. I've seen it work both ways. I've seen, frankly, the buyer broker fill it out for the seller and submit it, and that's okay too. But as you can see, this is kind of from the sellers. It's a notification the sellers previously sold the property. It's subject to a first sale. Here's your new closing date and all of that good stuff.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's complicated. It really is. Tessa, I always say our seller would love to put you in backup at X price, which would be the escalated price per the escalation addendum that was included. But for clarity, we pulled the escalation addendum out of the contract, which is best practice. That escalation clause is ugly. And it's a trick box. So simple little forms, but they carry a lot of clout. So today we've covered offer counteroffer, we've covered withdrawal of offer counteroffer, and we've covered backup addendums. So it was a good one. More tools for your toolbox. Hopefully you guys all learned something today. And a little bit of Jared. And it is on the 26th. I did confirm that because it does not compete with the CRS class of Chris Bird's, which is also a good one. That's going to be a busy week. So anything else for the good of the cause? Good one. Okay, don't forget, we've got basic contract mastery tomorrow morning, doing our financing addendum at 8:30. And next week are our regular business meetings, Tuesday for Whatcom, Wednesday for Gateway. So you guys have a great weekend. See you later.